Hi, I'm Marc Aramini. Welcome to the second part of my video series discussing Gene Wolfe and literature in general. Today I just wanted to review a few of the key components that I talked about last time. One of them was that I view Gene Wolfe from a modernist perspective. And this is somewhat important. And let me tell you real quickly the difference between this postmodern idea of the death of the author and this idea that art has a universal meaning that is actually pretty much set in stone. So let's talk real quickly about the concept of death of the author. One of the questions that we ask ourselves whenever we start to read something is, what's the purpose of this particular piece of literature? And if you look at didactic literature, literature that actually wants to accomplish something, then the author has a goal and an intent. And we talked a little bit last time about how one of Gene Wolfe's main goals is to actually entertain and tell a good story. However, there's a lot more going on in his work than just this simple intent. So, real quickly, let's look at a famous piece of didactic literature. And whenever we talk about literature, its relationship to science is kind of important in the 20th century. When Darwin's evolutionary ideas sprang to fruition, you saw the arisal of something that's commonly called naturalism. And naturalism takes scientific principles, right? The idea that human beings are just another animal in a system, and that they have to abide by certain rules, regulations, social expectations. And a lot of literature with didactic purpose actually arose out of this naturalistic idea, besides the old moralistic fables, right, where they're trying to teach you a very particular moral. And usually, naturalism was set on improving social conditions so that mankind and humanity as a whole could kind of achieve great things and live in excellent conditions. This is not quite the goal of Gene Wolfe's fiction, but I do want to talk about how naturalism used science and the repetition of themes and motifs to accomplish this goal. So let's look at a very famous example. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. In this particular work, we have a worker, right? A worker in the factories in the Midwest. And he's usually finding employment during the Depression in meat packing factories and in these slaughterhouses. And throughout the course of this text, Upton Sinclair wanted readers to empathize with the condition of this worker, the poor living conditions, the way that his life was a horror. That's what he wanted people to see, kind of have sympathy for his socialist agenda. When this work was actually published, readers latched onto something else. You had body parts in the meat, right? So as a result of his work, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, was actually formed as a result of people responding to this work. Was that the author's intent? No, not at all. However, there was a very real social result of his fiction. Wolfe does not quite occupy the same place in letters as naturalism does. He has very different aims. So when we talk about the reader coming to a text and expecting something, you may not agree with some of the moral aims that Wolfe is putting forth. However, there are still, I think, universal definitions and reference and allusions in his work that actually make a little bit of sense of the plot. So his use of didacticism and symbols and allusions, they're on a syntactic level. There are two basic ways that structuralists view meaning. One of them is called syntagmatic, and this is just the order of the words that create meaning. So it's kind of like what happened, right? So I'm going to give you an example of a syntagmatic error. On a claymation show called Celebrity Deathmatch, Jean-Claude Van Damme had to fight Jackie Chan, and it shows a scene of him doing takes to a movie where he can't get his lines right. Right? He's saying, "Gonna you die, Jackie. Die you gonna." And he finally gets his lines right. "You gonna die." Well, this is an example of the syntagmatic order. The other form of meaning is paradigmatic. And oftentimes this is the totality of all the allusions and references towards something. So it creates an effect. Gene Wolfe is interesting because his symbolism actually tends to modify both syntagmatic and paradigmatic meaning. And I'm going to give you very specific examples of this a little bit later in some of the dream sequences, right, where you have words such as, and Silk dreamed of mother, who was Chanel, who was Hyacinth, who was Cyprus. And this is a very specific syntagmatic order. However, it tends to imply something a little bit deeper for the plot than simply A happened, then B happened. So we'll come back to this a little bit later. Let's return real quickly to the idea that fiction should have a purpose. And despite what you think, fantasy fiction and SF as a whole, oftentimes, especially with Wolfe, actually does have a didactic message. Some of the criticisms that are leveled at Wolfe involve his worldview, right? We kind of live in a much more liberal society than we used to, and some of his narratives seems to espouse a very particular attitude toward, let's say, women in class distinctions. One of the things that I want to talk about is Gene Wolfe's use of irony. So I'm going to take a very specific story, Redbeard, which is found in The Best of Gene Wolfe. In this story, we have a narrator who is speaking with a friend, and his friend is telling him about a series of murders that have occurred in the town, where a bunch of women are killed by a man, and this murderer, is married to a girl who doesn't pay any attention to it, right? He has his room in the basement that he keeps locked, and she will not go in there. This is an inversion of the story of Bluebeard. The story of Bluebeard involves a man who marries these women, and then kind of serially kills them and locks them in a room, and he says, hey, to his new wife, I'm going to give you this key, but you can never ever go in there. That's my room. And of course here, curiosity gets the better of her. In Wolfe's version of this story, the actual narrative slant is very different, because it's concerned with the narrator's attitude. And he is a young man in a community of older people. And one of the metaphors that Gene Wolfe used to describe the generation gap in the people who've been there a long time and this new person who's moved into the area is that the old people existed like the old trees planted among the new beautiful houses. And this is a metaphor that occurs right at the beginning of the story. At the end of the story, he talks about these run-down old houses where young trees are planted. This is the dominant metaphor that makes sense of the story, because there's an ironic distance between what the narrator says and the actual implication of the story. When his friend tells the narrator about these murders, the narrator's not impressed at all. He says, well, John Wayne Gacy killed 40 or 50 people. Who cares about this? This is about as banal as you can get. But he hides that from his friend. He continually talks about the old way of doing things, where let's say a cop suspected someone of wrongdoing in the past. Well, they could just barge in, grab the evidence, and look at it. Now, with a modern mindset, that's an invasion of privacy, right? It's not following due process. He couldn't just look at the evidence without reasonable cause to suspect that he should be looking at it. He can't just pull up the person's personal belongings just because he suspects or believes that, hey, there's something amiss under there. He has to have a very good reason. So this dichotomy between the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things is presented through an ironic distance between the narrator and Gene Wolfe himself. So this narrator continually says what a banal story this is, how uninteresting it is, and how it has nothing to do with life in general. Then his friend reveals, at the very end, that the wife of the murderer eventually killed herself in her room. And he's not interested in that either. He says, oh, there's probably lots of reasons this could have happened. Maybe it's postpartum depression or baby blues. It could be anything, because she had just given birth to a child. And his friend agrees with him, and he says, well, you know, I'm her son, right? This matters to me. This is important to me. And here, his friend just kind of blamed him. And this is the new way of thinking. And that's unlivable. The dominant metaphor of the story shows how the old way of thinking is superior. It actually gets things done, and it blames the people who commit crimes instead of trying to assign blame to the victims. Right? And this moralistic didactic reasoning in Redbeard is complicated by the ironic distance between Gene Wolfe's narrator and the voice behind it. The metaphor where the old trees, right, are with new houses, livable environments. And the old people are like that old tree. Their way of living was livable. The new young trees can't really thrive in these ramshackle houses. And this metaphor surrounds the story and grounds the ironic distance between what the narrator says and what he actually means. And this will occur over and over again in Gene Wolfe's fiction. I would also like to begin to explore a very complicated text, probably Gene Wolfe's first bona fide masterpiece, The Fifth Head of Cerberus. And there are many ways to view this particular book, right, this collection of 3 novellas. However, when I was looking at some of the critical reception of these particular texts, what I found was that the middle portion, this kind of phantasmagorical story told by one of the characters in the first novella and in the last novella, right? It's related by him, but it's of a historical event, Frenchman's Landing, was not really integrated into most of the analysis of the stories. And it's actually an intrinsic key component to make sense of what actually happens in this particular tale. So real quickly, the first novella involves a brothel owner, right, who has cloned a son, number 5. That's all he calls him. And this boy, number 5, is kind of stuck in the same pattern of repetition, of doing the same thing over and over, until eventually he will commit the same atrocities and set up the same closed system that his father, who he comes to resent, did. So he's trapped in this loop, this unchanging loop. The backdrop of this, however, is that there are 2 sister planets, Saint Croix and Saint Anne, and his city, Port Mimizan, in Saint Croix, right? It's kind of French dominated. You'll have to forgive my French if I mispronounce some of these words. Is decayed, right? There have been no new buildings there in almost 2 centuries, and there are all these strange cultural phenomena. For example, when they go to arrest someone, the people who arrest this gentleman indicate that a week ago, they might have been working in garbage collection, or they might have been doing something else at the city, or maybe they, were public entertainers. So everyone in the city has a role that constantly fluctuates, and no one seems able to actually build new things or create anything that has lasting meaning. And one of the features of the city is that it's based around the structure of a hand. So he says, in one of the fingers of Port Mamizan, or in the thumb near the port, right? So this structure is based on a hand. And this is one of the symbolic things that we need to pay attention to whenever we're analyzing Wolfe's fiction. Because the backdrop of this novella, which Ursula Le Guin said was the uncertainty principle embodied in fiction. Now, while that may be a bit of hyperbole, there is a lot of question about identity over the course of this book. In the middle section, you have a look at the planet of St. Anne, where these aborigines on the planet are kind of subjected to their internecine feuds. And at the very beginning, the main character of that novella, Sandwalker, is born. The imagery that is associated with his birth is that of someone who descends from a high place to a low place. So his feet hit the ground as soon as he's born. And his mother is there with her mother. And her mother immediately kind of covers her legs in soil in this ritual that is very poorly understood until you start to see that there are patterns of meaning through these aboriginal reference to hands and legs themselves that create a larger pattern of meaning that will help us actually distinguish what's going on in the final sections of this 3-novella collection. So, in the first novella, we have cloning and a repeated pattern where this man, right, this human man, number 5, is a product of a cloning experiment. And he is raised with a strange ant who kind of floats around because her legs dangle uselessly, right? Aubrey Veal is one of her pseudonyms. Aubrey means elf queen, and she is kind of famous for this hypothesis that all of the people have been replaced with aboriginal mimics from St. Anne. Now, when you go to St. Anne and you visit it in the third novella, you see that these people there live a much more primitive lifestyle than in Port Mimizan and St. Croix. They are there kind of scrounging a living by selling goods and supposedly pretending to be descended from the Aboriginals and selling their relics and artifacts, while the real Aboriginals are in the back of beyond somewhere, lingering and hidden. And an anthropologist named John Marsh goes to visit St. Anne in his hopes of encountering this Aboriginal culture. And he hires a guide there. And this guide, right, is the son of someone who sells these Aboriginal products and actually says that, hey, I'm descended from Aboriginals as well. So he sends John Marsh into the wilderness with this boy, Victor Trenchard. Now, Victor has a cat. Right? And this cat is kind of strange because he's always holding it and he's always kind of coddling it. And there is a point where John Marsh's narrative says that he can no longer write because he's been bitten by the cat. And this is one of the most interesting things that Gene Wolfe does, because the first time we read it, if we're not paying attention, we may believe that the reason he can't write is because the cat has bitten him. The second time we look at this story, right, and this is kind of the basis of John Clute's analysis of the story, which I'm going to get to more thoroughly in a minute, the Aborigines have dysfunctional hands. They can't write. So we think, oh my gosh, right? It's not because of a cat bite. It's because he can't write. He's been replaced by this Aboriginal boy who's taken his place. There is a death scene of Victor Trenchard at the end of the novel. He falls to his death, and there's a very odd description of a tree branch kind of reaching out to save him. Now, this tree imagery we're going to come back to in just a little bit. It's very complicated, and it's not easy for me to, in this verbal expression, talk about all the instances where these trees show up. However, you should definitely pay attention on your next read-through of the fifth head of Cerberus to all these trees and what they're actually doing on St. Anne. When Victor Trenchard falls, as I said, this branch reaches out for him as if to save him, and he dies. And on the reading that says that Victor Trenchard has replaced Marsh, we have to believe that this entire scene is a lie, right? It's a fabrication, and that he is taking the place of Marsh and goes to St. Croix to kind of escape and pretend to be Marsh, this anthropologist. His journals are confiscated when he's there, and he's placed in a cell, right? He is incarcerated when he arrives there. And the reason that they give is they suspect that he may be trying to assassinate someone. But really, they have this method of incarceration that seems pretty permanent, just on suspicion. Because he's different than everyone there, they feel they have the right to throw him away and just forget about him. Right? Every sense is that Marsh is going to be incarcerated for the rest of his life, as long as it is, if he's not executed out of hand. Now, when you look at it, you may say, hey, this guy is an Aborigine. However, there are other things at work in the text that really undercut this accepted reading. One of them is that there's two alien species in the middle novella. There's the Aborigines and the Shadow Children. And this is very confusing. These Shadow Children are empathic creatures who come to take on the features of everyone that they hang out with. They say when there's a lot of them, right, they have a strong sense of identity. But as they reduce their numbers, they come to believe that they are exactly like whoever they're near. And the interesting thing about Marsh as he's incarcerated there is that he has some of Victor Trenchard's childhood memories. However, when you look at what happened to Marsh, he was bitten, right, by this cat. He couldn't write for 3 days, and then he kind of arose as something new. Right, something new, as he was able to actually write again, something different than the Marsh that was. What actually happened is that the cat bite was responsible for his poor penmanship, because that was kind of a remnant of the Shadow Child infection. In the third novella, there are all these references to the Shadow Children, where they say, don't ask me how big they are. They're the size of a child. Right? How big is a child? These references to their size, that they can actually rise up in air currents and in the marshes. This confuses the literal nature of the middle novella. In the middle novella, a story by John V. Marsh, at the culmination of it, the conclusion, Sandwalker and his brother Eastwind, right, are kind of in a little fight, and the Shadow Children who have been around them say that we're going to switch you, right? We're going to switch you, and you're going to understand what your brother's like. And he bites one of them, right? He bites one of them on the arm, Eastwind. He bites on the arm, and immediately Sandwalker believes that he sweeps Eastwind's feet out from under him and drowns him in the river. So brother kills brother in this ending. However, his arm hurts, right? And this bite is the culmination of everything. And when the Frenchmen land here right after this, there is a very strange section in the Ace paperback that was actually changed in future versions. So I just wanted to read the ending of this very quickly, because this was actually modified, probably by a copy editor. Alright. And it reads, "This is a game for children. He should die." Sandwalker kicked Eastwind's feet so that he fell into the water, held him there until he felt the body go limp. When he straightened up, he said to the last Shadow Child, "I spoke." "Yes, but now I don't know if I'm Sandwalker or Eastwind in his dream." "And neither do I," said the Shadow Child. "But there's something happening down there on the beach. Shall we go and see?" The mist was burning away. Sandwalker looked where the Shadow Child pointed and saw that where the river joined moaning ocean, a green thing was bobbing in the water. 3 men with their limbs wrapped in leaves stood on the sand near it, pointing at the stranded body of Last Voice, and talking a speech Sandwalker did not understand. When he came close to them, they extended their hands open and smiled. But they did not understand that open hands meant, or had meant once, that they held no weapons. His people had never known weapons. That night Sandwalker dreamed that he was dead, but the long dreaming days were over. In future editions, the they is changed to he. He did not know, right, that open hands meant they held no weapons. And I believe this was actually a misreading, because here what's actually happening is as the Aborigines approach the Frenchmen, they're taking their place, they're empathizing with them, and changing themselves to their perspective. Now, in the 3rd novella, it says that the East Wind was the one who actually survived here. And if you look at the images of Sandwalker throughout the middle novella, his feet always hitting the ground. At the end there, the one who dies has his feet swept out from under him. However, there's an easy way to tell the difference, because Eastwind has been ritually castrated by his tribe. He doesn't have testicles, and Sandwalker does. All he has to do to verify who he is take a look down below, right? That's it. So, in this story, the reason that this confusion is there is because Wolfe subscribes very thoroughly to Chekhov's gun. The idea that if there's a gun on the wall, it needs to be fired by the final act. There's 2 alien species. The uncertainty there, the lack of building in porte-ma-maison, which means mimicry. There are streets there, like Rue d'Astico, which means street of larvae or maggots, right? And saltimbanque, which means a charlatan. All these images imply forgery, because what's really happened is that the Aboriginals have taken the place of the Frenchmen, have then taken over porte-ma-maison. The useless hand of the Aborigines is porte-ma-maison, right? That's what doesn't function anymore. However, they believe themselves to be human. What John Marsh is a shadow child. He's been bitten by this cat, right? And that's the culmination that switches Sandwalker and Eastwind as well. And there is also in the 3rd novella mention of a parasite that's airborne, right? An airborne parasite that infects workers. It's really good with the string that it shoots out, and it uses that to navigate. Well, guess what? The Aboriginals are also very good with the string. Marsh's studies label the Aboriginal culture as pre-dendritic. What this means, pre-dendritic, means like a tree. It extends like neurons out. This tree imagery is repeated over and over throughout the novellas. Even number 5 dreams of these columns that are revealed to be columns of trees. And one of the words that he sees on them is carapace. there's some indication in the middle novella that the trees are actually the fathers of some of the Aboriginal children. So it seems as if their life cycle involves a larval stage, because they say when they were young they were long and lived in the roots of trees. Then they kind of blossomed. Another copy editing change that occurred in the middle novella is the name of a daughter. In future versions it would be Mary Pink Butterflies. In this 8th version it's Many Pink Butterflies. What do butterflies do? They transform into an adult stage from a larval kind of pre-existence to something that's full. So when these human beings on Port Mamizon, or supposed human beings, incarcerate John Marsh, it's really a subjugation of one alien species by another. The only human that is left is number 5 in his cycle of continual cloning. He's there because in the absence of true humans, these people on Port Mamizon have continued to degrade. And we're not supposed to look at their hands. We're supposed to look at their legs. These long, useless legs of Aubreville, who is called a black queen to some white queen that number 5 would never meet. There are other leg injuries, these long staff-like legs that most of the women at the brothel have. And even later, when Celestine Etienne is described, it's with these supernaturally long legs. Well, in the middle story, the Aborigines are described with a heron-like walk, these long, skinny, inutile legs. And there's some indication that men are motile longer than the females. So when you read this, Clute's assertion that VRT stands for Victor Trenchard is perhaps not as accurate as the idea that it stands for an engineering term, variance reduction techniques, in which a series of approximations have occurred. We fire both alien species, those guns on the wall, right? The Aborigines have replaced the humans, and the shadow children are lurking in the background with their empathetic knowledge kind of blending human and Aborigine, so that you really can't tell the difference. So there is a universal conclusion here, where we have the Aboriginal culture decaying human culture. There's nobody to imitate anymore. And then John Marsh comes into it, and he's actually infected by these shadow children parasites. At the bottom of this video, you'll find a link to a very long article with textual evidence that I really can't get into right now. Next time, we're going to talk much more thoroughly about peace and the Book of the New Sun. One of the things that I did want to mention is that this cat bite transforming into a different implication where we think he's lying, and then we realize, hey, it really was because of the cat bite, but we just didn't understand the reason before, is something that's going to happen in Wolfe over and over. In the Book of the New Sun, when Severian comes across Dorcas for the first time. If you're familiar with your biblical history, right, in the Acts of the Apostles, you know, Tabitha Dorcas is raised from the dead, then that's not as surprising of a revelation later on. However, the reason that it's done, we don't know that he has the claw yet that very first time. So later we think, oh, it's because of the claw of the conciliator that he could resurrect Dorcas. Yet, when you look at it again, when he first reaches for Triskel at the very opening of Book of the New Sun, you see that Triskel is described as the smallest of those dead. We realize that our initial impression, that it's not because of the claw, it's because of some innate quality of Severian, might be more correct than the idea that the claw itself, this artifact, is responsible for it. And the cat bite in the 5th head of Cerberus operates in exactly that way. Thank you very much for listening. And hopefully we'll be able to go more specifically into peace in the Book of the New Sun, as well as explore some of these criticisms on Gene Wolfe. Have a great day.